Hey, Pastor George, how you doing today?
I'm doing well, my friend. How about yourself?
I'm doing great. I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me again.
I'm always happy to sit down with you. What's on your mind today?
So, Pastor George, just a quick question. In the beginning of the Bible, the book of Genesis, we have the account of creation, correct? And you believe in a literal Adam and Eve. You think this is a real story that happened, right?
Yes, I do. I believe Genesis 1 through 3 is a literal, historical account. God created Adam and Eve as real people, the first human beings, and they really fell into sin in the Garden of Eden.
Right. So they fell into sin in the Garden of Eden, and they ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and that was the one tree that they were not permitted to eat from. And before they ate from that tree, they had no knowledge whatsoever of good and evil. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. Before they ate from the tree, Adam and Eve had no knowledge of good and evil. They were innocent. They only knew what was good because everything God made was good. They didn't have a moral conscience like we do today.
They had no moral conscience and they had no concept of right and wrong. Is that fair to say?
Yes, that's fair to say. They had no moral conscience and no concept of right and wrong before they ate from that tree.
Okay, Pastor George. So they had no moral conscience. They didn't know what was right and what was wrong. So, how did they know that it was wrong and morally incorrect to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil and disobey God? Because since they couldn't have known what was right and wrong, they couldn't have known that it was wrong to disobey God.
That's actually a very good question. They didn't need a moral conscience to know it was wrong. God gave them a very simple, direct command: You shall not eat from that tree. They knew exactly what God had told them not to do. Their sin wasn't that they violated some deep internal sense of morality they didn't have yet. Their sin was simple disobedience to a clear command that God had personally given them. They didn't need to understand why it was wrong. They just needed to trust and obey the one who gave them the command. That's where they failed.
Now, Pastor George, you misunderstand my question. I'm not saying did they understand why it was wrong. I'm saying they didn't know it was wrong to disobey God. So how can they be held morally accountable when they didn't know that disobeying God was wrong? I know God gave them a direct command not to eat from the tree, but they didn't know that disobedience was wrong because they had no concept of right and wrong.
I understand your question now. The issue is this: how can God hold Adam and Eve morally responsible for disobeying Him when they had no concept of right and wrong before they ate the fruit? The answer is that moral accountability doesn't require an internal sense of morality first. It only requires a clear command from the one who has authority over you. God spoke directly to Adam and told him not to eat from that tree. That command itself created the moral obligation. They didn't need to feel that disobedience was wrong. The fact that their Creator commanded them not to do it was enough. When they chose to disobey the direct word of God, that was sin, even though their conscience wasn't developed yet. Does that make sense to you?
No, because it's not that they needed to feel that it was wrong. They had no way of knowing it was wrong. When they disobeyed God, they could not have known that disobedience was wrong because they had no concept of right and wrong.
My friend, this is where the text is very clear. God gave them a direct command. That command itself was the standard. They didn't need an internal moral compass to know they were doing something wrong. They simply needed to know that God had said, "Don't do this." When they did it anyway, they were guilty of disobeying their Creator. The knowledge of good and evil came as a result of their disobedience, not as a requirement before they could be held accountable. God held them responsible because they rebelled against His clear word, not because they had a fully developed conscience.
Yes, but they didn't know it was wrong to rebel against His clear word.
My friend, I understand what you're saying, but you're creating a standard that the Bible itself doesn't require. Adam and Eve didn't need to know it was wrong in the way you're describing. They knew God had told them not to eat from the tree. That was enough. Their guilt came from the simple fact that they chose to do what God had explicitly forbidden them to do. The idea that they needed some prior understanding of this is morally wrong before they could be held accountable is something you're bringing to the text, not something the text itself teaches. God is the standard of right and wrong. When he speaks, obedience is right and disobedience is wrong, period. They knew what he had said. That was all they needed to know.
If Adam and Eve already knew that obeying God was right and disobeying him was wrong, then what knowledge of good and evil did the fruit actually give them?
That's actually an excellent question. The knowledge they gained from the fruit was not the basic knowledge that obeying God is right and disobeying him is wrong. They already understood that on a basic level because God had spoken directly to them. What the fruit gave them was the experiential knowledge of evil. Before they ate it, they only knew good. They had never experienced evil, rebellion, guilt, shame, or a corrupted conscience. After they ate, they now had personal, intimate knowledge of both good and evil. They now understood evil from the inside, not just as a concept. That's why their eyes were opened and they suddenly felt shame and tried to hide from God. They had crossed into a whole new kind of knowledge that they didn't have before.
Okay, Pastor George, but where does Genesis actually say that the tree gave them experiential knowledge of evil rather than knowledge of good and evil itself? Because the text calls it the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And after they eat, God says the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. You're saying they already knew good and evil conceptually beforehand and only gained experiential knowledge afterward. Where does the text make that distinction?
No, the text itself does not explicitly make that distinction. That's a fair observation. The tree is called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And after they eat, God says, the man has now become like one of us, knowing good and evil. On a plain reading, it sounds like this knowledge came as a direct result of eating the fruit. The reason many of us, including me, still make the distinction between basic understanding and experiential knowledge is because of what the text shows before they ate. Eve clearly understood God's command and repeated it to the serpent, Genesis 3:2-3. She knew she wasn't supposed to eat from that tree. If they had zero concept of right and wrong, God's command wouldn't have made any sense to them, and their disobedience couldn't have been held against them. So we conclude that knowing good and evil in this context means something deeper than basic moral awareness. It means gaining the personal, intimate, experiential knowledge of evil by actually doing it. They went from innocence to having evil inside them. You're right though, the text doesn't spell out that distinction in those exact words. It's something we infer from the whole story. Does that feel like a reasonable inference to you, or does it still seem like we're reading something into the text?
I appreciate you acknowledging that, Pastor George, because I think that's really where the disagreement is. It seems to me that the experiential knowledge distinction is being inferred largely because the alternate creates a theological problem. If Adam and Eve didn't yet possess the knowledge necessary to understand good and evil, then holding them morally responsible seems difficult. But if they already knew that obeying God was good and disobeying him was evil, then they already possessed some knowledge of good and evil before eating from a tree specifically called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So I think either way, there's a tension there. I understand your interpretation, but I don't think Genesis itself clearly gives us that solution. Let me end with one question. Do you at least agree that someone reading Genesis by itself, without bringing later Christian theology into it, could reasonably wonder how Adam and Eve could be morally culpable for choosing evil before eating from the tree that gave them knowledge of good and evil?
Yes, I do agree. If someone is simply reading Genesis by itself, without bringing in later Christian theology, it's very reasonable for them to wonder exactly what you're wondering. The text doesn't explain how Adam and Eve could be held accountable for doing something wrong when they hadn't yet eaten from the tree that gave them the knowledge of good and evil. That tension is real when you stay strictly within the Genesis account. The explanation I gave earlier comes from reading Genesis in light of the whole rest of the Bible, not from Genesis standing alone. So you're right. Someone reading just those chapters could legitimately ask, how could they have known it was wrong before they had the knowledge of good and evil? I appreciate you pushing me to be honest about that.
And I appreciate your honesty again, Pastor George, in conceding that you understand a plain reading of the text does not seem to agree with what your deeper theological explanation does. As always, I appreciate your time and speaking with me today, and I look forward to our next discussion.
You're welcome, my friend. I appreciate you pushing me to be honest with the text. I'm always happy to talk with you. Take care, and I'll look forward to our next conversation. God bless you.